Super Typhoon Ragasa, the most powerful tropical cyclone of the year, made landfall in southern China on Wednesday, unleashing catastrophic winds, torrential rains, and coastal flooding that paralyzed cities and forced the evacuation of over 2 million residents. The storm, which had already carved a deadly path through the Philippines and Taiwan, struck the Guangdong province with sustained winds exceeding 200 kilometers per hour and gusts peaking at 250 kilometers per hour. Originating in the western Pacific, Ragasa intensified rapidly into a Category 5 Super Typhoon earlier this week. It first battered the northern Philippines, where at least 10 people died, including 7 fishermen whose boat capsized off the coast of Cagayan province. Over 25,000 residents sought shelter in emergency facilities as floodwaters inundated homes and landslides cut off mountain roads. In Taiwan, Ragasa triggered the overflow of a barrier lake in Hualien County, sending a wall of water crashing into Guangfu township. 17 fatalities were confirmed, and 33 people remain missing. The deluge destroyed bridges, swept away vehicles, and left entire neighborhoods submerged in mud and debris. As Ragasa approached China's southern coast, authorities issued the highest-level typhoon warnings and mobilized emergency response teams. The storm made landfall near Yangjiang in Guangdong province, a region home to over 125 million people and a vital economic hub. Streets in megacities like Guangzhou and Shenzhen emptied as millions sheltered indoors. The Chinese government evacuated more than 2 million residents from vulnerable coastal and low-lying areas. Schools, factories, and public transportation were suspended across 12 cities. Military units delivered aid and conducted rescue operations, while state media reported widespread damage to infrastructure, including collapsed roads, downed power lines, and flooded subway systems. Hong Kong bore the brunt of Ragasa's fury on Tuesday and Wednesday. The city's observatory raised the number 10 typhoon signal, the highest alert level, as waves taller than lampposts crashed over promenades and seawater surged into buildings. The Fullerton Ocean Park Hotel was inundated when glass doors shattered under the pressure of incoming waves. More than 100 people were injured, and 885 residents sought refuge in emergency shelters. Authorities reported over 1,000 fallen trees and 85 cases of flooding. Public transport was halted, flights were canceled, and kindergartens remained closed even as the storm weakened into a tropical system on Thursday. In Yangjiang, where Ragasa made landfall, the storm's impact was immediate and devastating. Skyscrapers swayed under the force of the wind, and entire neighborhoods lost power. Emergency crews worked around the clock to clear debris, rescue stranded residents, and restore essential services. The provincial government allocated tens of millions of dollars for disaster relief and deployed thousands of personnel to assist in recovery efforts. The economic toll is expected to be severe. In Macau, casinos and public venues were shuttered to prevent damage, while supply chains across southern China face disruption. Agricultural losses are mounting as floodwaters ravaged crops and livestock. Meteorologists warn that warming seas and shifting climate patterns are fueling stronger, more destructive typhoons. Ragasa's rapid intensification and wide-reaching impact exemplify the growing threat posed by extreme weather events in the region. Experts note that the storm's trajectory, cutting across densely populated and economically vital areas, amplified its humanitarian and financial consequences. The aftermath of Ragasa has sparked calls for improved disaster preparedness and early warning systems. In Taiwan, residents of Guangfu township criticized the lack of mandatory evacuation orders before the barrier lake burst. "We were told to move to higher floors, but there was no urgency," said Layman Panay, a local counselor. In the Philippines, President Bongbong Marcos activated national disaster response agencies and suspended government operations across 29 provinces. Despite these efforts, the storm exposed vulnerabilities in infrastructure and emergency coordination. As Ragasa continues its westward drift toward Vietnam and Laos, it is expected to weaken further. However, residual rains and flooding remain a concern for inland regions. Chinese meteorological agencies have downgraded the storm but continue to monitor its remnants for potential regeneration. Recovery in the affected areas will take weeks, if not months. For millions across Asia, Ragasa was not just a storm, it was a reckoning. From shattered coastlines to submerged cities, the super typhoon left behind a trail of destruction that will reshape communities and policies for years to come. As Super Typhoon Ragasa roared ashore along China's southern coast, the city of Zhuhai found itself at the epicenter of a storm surge disaster that overwhelmed defenses, submerged entire districts, and left tens of thousands displaced. The tropical cyclone, already infamous for its deadly path across the Philippines and Taiwan, brought not only fierce winds but a wall of water that transformed coastal Zhuhai into a flooded labyrinth of chaos and survival. At 3:45 a.m. local time, Ragasa's outer bands began pushing seawater inland, breaching seawalls and inundating low-lying neighborhoods. By sunrise, the storm surge had reached over 3.2 meters in some areas, well above historical records. The coastal districts of Xiangzhou, Jida, and Gongbei were hardest hit, with floodwaters rushing through streets, swallowing vehicles, and crashing into storefronts. Residents described the scene as apocalyptic. "It wasn't just rain, it was the ocean invading our homes," said Lu Wan, a shopkeeper in Gongbei whose family escaped to the rooftop as water levels rose. The waves came with such force, they shattered windows and carried away everything. Zhuhai's famed Lovers' Road promenade, a symbol of the city's coastal charm, was obliterated. Sections of the seawall collapsed under the pressure of the surge, and the boardwalk was torn apart by waves that hurled debris across the waterfront. The city's underground drainage system, designed for seasonal monsoons, proved inadequate against Ragasa's fury. Power outages swept across the city as substations flooded and transformers exploded. The Zhuhai light rail was suspended indefinitely after tracks were submerged and stations damaged. Telecommunications were disrupted, leaving thousands unable to contact loved ones or emergency services. Authorities had issued red alerts and evacuation orders 24 hours prior to landfall, but the speed and intensity of the surge caught many off guard. Over 85,000 residents were evacuated to higher ground or emergency shelters, including schools, stadiums, and government buildings. Rescue teams deployed inflatable boats and amphibious vehicles to reach stranded families. Zhuhai's fire brigade reported over 1,200 emergency calls in the first 12 hours of the storm. In one dramatic rescue, a team of divers retrieved a trapped elderly couple from a submerged apartment complex in Jida. They were clinging to a ceiling beam, barely breathing, said Captain Zhang Rui. "We got there just in time." The economic damage is staggering. Initial estimates suggest losses exceeding 12 billion yen, $1.65 billion, with thousands of businesses destroyed and critical infrastructure crippled. Zhuhai's port operations were suspended, disrupting trade routes and supply chains across the Pearl River Delta. Environmental damage is also mounting. The storm surge contaminated freshwater reservoirs with seawater and industrial runoff. Mangrove forests along the coast were uprooted, and marine ecosystems suffered as sediment and debris choked estuaries. Human stories amid the deluge. At least 17 fatalities have been confirmed in Zhuhai, including a rescue worker swept away during operations and a child who drowned in a flooded underpass. Dozens remain missing, and the search continues. Typhoon Ragasa's impact on Zhuhai has reignited debate over urban resilience and climate adaptation. Experts point to outdated flood maps, insufficient storm surge modeling, and overdevelopment along vulnerable coastlines. Zhuhai's rapid expansion has outpaced its disaster preparedness, said Dr. Lin Xiaoyan, a climate risk analyst at Sun Yat-sen University. The city's reliance on seawalls and drainage canals, while effective against seasonal rains, proved inadequate against Ragasa's compound threat of wind, rain, and surge. Calls are growing for investment in nature-based solutions, such as restored wetlands and permeable infrastructure. Zhuhai's disaster has implications beyond its borders. As part of the Greater Bay Area, the city plays a key role in regional logistics, tourism, and tech manufacturing. Delays in port operations and factory shutdowns are expected to ripple across supply chains in Shenzhen, Macau, and Hong Kong. President Xi Jinping issued a directive calling for all-out efforts in rescue and recovery. The central government dispatched military units, medical teams, and engineering corps to assist. Emergency funds have been allocated, and reconstruction plans are underway. Zhuhai's mayor, Huang Jiwei, pledged transparency and accountability. "We will rebuild stronger, safer, and smarter," he said in a televised address. "But we must also learn from this tragedy." As waters recede and the city begins the arduous task of recovery, Ragasa leaves behind more than destruction. It leaves a reckoning. For Zhuhai, the storm was not just a natural disaster but a test of preparedness, governance, and community resilience. From shattered seawalls to stories of heroism, the floodwaters of Ragasa have etched themselves into the city's memory. And as climate change continues to intensify storms across Asia, Zhuhai's experience may serve as a warning and a lesson for coastal cities everywhere. As Super Typhoon Ragasa tore through southern China, the city of Shenzhen, a global tech powerhouse and home to over 17 million residents, was plunged into crisis. The storm's arrival brought hurricane-force winds, torrential rain, and a devastating storm surge that overwhelmed coastal defenses, crippled infrastructure, and exposed systemic vulnerabilities in one of China's most modern urban centers. Ragasa made landfall near Yangjiang early Wednesday, but its eastern eye wall, often the most violent quadrant of a typhoon, swept directly across Shenzhen's coastline. Wind gusts reached 230 kilometers per hour, toppling cranes, shattering glass facades, and uprooting thousands of trees. Rainfall totals exceeded 400 millimeters in less than 24 hours, triggering flash floods across Fujian, Nanshan, and Baoan districts. The storm surge, amplified by high tide and funneling through the Pearl River Delta, breached seawalls and inundated coastal zones. Yantian Port, one of the busiest container terminals in the world, was forced to shut down as water levels surged over 3 meters, flooding warehouses and submerging cargo yards. Shenzhen's famed skyline dimmed as widespread power outages swept through the city. Transformer stations were submerged, and high-voltage lines snapped under wind stress. The metro system was suspended after tunnels flooded and ventilation shafts failed to contain rising water. In Nanshan, the Qianhai Business District, a symbol of China's economic ambition, suffered severe damage. Office towers swayed under the storm's force, and underground parking garages filled with water, trapping dozens of vehicles. Emergency crews worked through the night to rescue stranded workers and pump out submerged infrastructure. Telecommunications were disrupted as cell towers collapsed and fiber optic lines were severed. For hours, large swaths of the city were cut off from digital communication, complicating rescue coordination and family reunifications. Despite early warnings and mass evacuations, the storm's intensity caught many off guard. Over 300,000 residents were relocated to emergency shelters, including schools, stadiums, and government buildings. Yet some communities, especially in informal housing zones along rivers and canals, were left vulnerable. At least 23 fatalities have been confirmed in Shenzhen, including construction workers trapped in a collapsed scaffold and elderly residents unable to evacuate in time. More than 120 people were injured, and dozens remain missing. In Bowen, a firefighter carried a disabled woman through waist-deep water to safety. In Luohu, volunteers formed human chains to guide children out of a flooded subway station. The economic impact of Ragasa on Shenzhen is expected to be profound. Initial estimates suggest direct losses exceeding 25 billion yen, $3.4 billion USD, with long-term disruptions to manufacturing, logistics, and trade. Tech giants including Huawei, Tencent, and BYD temporarily suspended operations, citing damage to facilities and employee safety concerns. Yantian Port's closure sent ripples through global supply chains, delaying shipments of electronics, textiles, and automotive components. Export orders were canceled or rerouted, and international clients expressed concern over future reliability. Beyond the urban devastation, Ragasa left a scar on Shenzhen's natural environment. The storm surge contaminated freshwater reservoirs with seawater and industrial runoff. Mangrove forests along Shenzhen Bay were uprooted, and bird habitats were destroyed. The Shenzhen River, swollen by rainfall and surge, overflowed its banks, flooding parks and green belts. Environmental agencies warned of increased risk of waterborne diseases and long-term ecological degradation. Ragasa's assault on Shenzhen has reignited debate over urban resilience in the face of climate change. Despite billions invested in smart infrastructure and flood mitigation, the city struggled to withstand the compound threat of wind, rain, and surge.